Everybody, welcome from me, Gavin Morgan, tutor at University College London and senior EP in Cambridgeshire, and it's really great to be here amongst so many old friends and colleagues. Just a little bit of a background really about the conference and how we ended up with the theme that we're going to be developing over the next couple of days. It all happened in 1 week. Back in March. During that week, there was the budget speech led by George Osborne. Remember him? And weirdly, during the budget speech, a speech about economics, he was making some announcements about education policy, in particular about the kind of forced academisation of primary schools. And this kind of got me thinking, it kind of jarred with me a bit, thinking, why is the Chancellor announcing policy seemingly off the hoof about academies and about schools and about school development? And it kind of got me thinking, do they just make this stuff up? And also around that time, that very week, we had a committee meeting. And as part of that, as part of my role as being conference lead, I was going to make a pitch to the committee about the theme of the conference that you're at now. And as luck would have it, that week I bought a copy of Melissa Ben's book, The Truth About Our Schools. And clearly Melissa's going to be here this afternoon, which I'm really looking forward to. And that got me thinking, on the train journey on the way down to London for the committee meeting, I was flicking through Melissa's book. And there was evidence, there was stuff, there was facts and evidence all about policy and policies that governments and education secretaries should be taking rather than decisions being made seemingly, like I said, off the hoof by the Chancellor. So that then led me to thinking, well, this is what we need to kind of focus on as a group of psychologists. We need evidence. We need to back up what is happening with real kind of evidence-based, evidence-informed research. And again, we had, during the referendum campaign, we had the infamous quote from Michael Gove that, we've had enough of experts. And I don't think we have. I don't think we have at the DECP at all. We need more. We need more of that. We need more experts. Which leads me on to introduce our first expert this morning, our first keynote speaker, Professor Dan Goodley. And I was first introduced to Dan, who came to a session at UCL in April, I think it was, when he gave a session to us, a group of tutors, about his work and about his research. And I was that kind of awestruck by listening to what Dan was saying, thinking, this is going to be perfect for us. This is going to be perfect for the DECP. So as soon as Dan had finished, I went straight up to him and invited him to deliver a keynote, and I'm pleased to say he readily accepted. And Dan works for the School of Education in Sheffield. He is a psychology graduate, as he will explain to you this morning. He's got a very troubled relationship with psychology. And again, I think this is really interesting stuff. It's going to make you think. It's going to challenge your thoughts. It's going to challenge your assumptions about disability. But I think that's what we're here for. That's healthy. We're here to be challenged. We're here to be exposed to new ideas and new ways of thinking. And I really hope that you enjoy Dan's session. Dan.
Thank you very much. Expertise, I'm a bit worried about that one. I've got two daughters, unbelievably now, one of them is 16 on Monday and the other is 14. And the 16-year-old was asked when she was about 9 years old what her dad did for a living. And she said, he writes books using words that no one understands, read by nobody. So I believe that's called an expert. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for the opportunity to come along, and thank you for the invite. And yes, I'm a psychology graduate. I graduated from what was Manchester Polytechnic and then became a university in their final year, much to my father's relief. And that psychology degree I had, I came across a guy called Tom Billington, who I now work with, and people like Ian Parker and Erica Berman. I'm sure people that you know here. The relationship I still have with psychology is a troubled one in the sense that I think psychology has traditionally done some quite dangerous things to disabled young people. At the same time, psychology and educational psychology is often one of the key places where we can actually enable young people. And so I have a kind of, troubled, maybe a contradictory relationship, but I don't think I'm the only one in the room here with that. So in this paper, what I want to do is to draw upon some recent work with colleagues in Sheffield and Manchester. And I want to respond to some inspirational writers and writings. Drawing on research projects and intellectual moments of engagement, the paper considers the ways in which disability disavows normative constructions of the human. I use the term disavowal in its original Freudian psychoanalytic sense, to simultaneously and ambivalently desire the human and at the same time reject it. And I will then clarify and expand upon this disavowal with explicit reference to the work that we've been doing with young people with intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities. And in that, I want to make a case for the category of human, but to argue that this category needs expanding as well as desiring. So this contradictory, troubled relationship with psychology, I'm also going to say that we should also have with the human, or the way in which the human category is often understood. And indeed, an undergirding contention of my paper is that young people with intellectual disabilities are already engaged in some really sophisticated political work with the category of the human. And actually, I don't just tell you guys this, but we know through educational psychology that when we listen to young people, we reveal some deeply sophisticated identity work, and in this case, some sophisticated work with what we might understand to be human. And then the paper the paper starts off by outlining 7 reasons why we should care about this thing called the human, and I end up moving to consider 4 human elements: support, frailty, capacity, and desire. And I think about disability's place in redefining these elements. So, a question that's guiding, if you like, my colleagues and myself, is this quite tricky question: what does it mean to be human? The question is, of course, hardly a new one. There's something called humanities. Psychology, of course, is involved in the discovery, and some might argue the constitution and construction of the human. But I want to pick out some kind of reasons why we might want to ask this question. The first is thanks to a friend and Canadian sociologist and disability studies scholar, Tanya Tichkowski. She asks us to think about what disability reveals about human selves, subjectivities, and social worlds. So, for example, in her book, The Question of Access, which is looking at inclusion, exclusion within educational settings, she makes a simple but not simplistic point. When disability demands inclusion in social and educational spaces, it, at the same time, reveals the exclusionary nature of those spaces. In demanding inclusion, disability says straight away, clearly there's exclusion here. So access then is revealed by disability as something that we need to deliberate and work on together. And it seems that the questions of inclusion are very human questions. The second reason for thinking about this question of the human, and this is where I'm talking about kind of inspirational writings, Tanya was the first, here's another one, is brought about through the work of Sylvia Wynter. She's a post-colonial scholar. And her analysis makes clear that the colonization of the Americas and other parts of the globe, erroneously termed the New World, led inevitably to a split between what she calls dominant ethno-class man, or Donald Trump, and the rest of the empirical human world, engaged in human struggle. Let me say that again. There's a quote from her. And the rest of the empirical human world engaged in human struggle. I think it's beautiful. Because what she does is, through this kind of post-colonial attitude, makes a number of important points. The first, she says, is the human category is the category constituted by the white man. And indeed, those, to use her language, members of the empirical human world, including poor people, black people, non-European, and of course disabled people, are rarely permitted access to the category of the human. This, it seems to me, is a challenging and unsettling realization. And I think if one thinks of some of the arguments that's going on currently about post-truth politics, or particularly around Trump, I don't buy the post-truth ideas. I think what we're seeing with Trump is a restating, a narrowing of the neoliberal subject. Make sure you're not Mexican or disabled, because you'll get mocked, but still people will vote you in. So I think what we need here are some key questions about the kinds of human that are being valued. And of course, I don't need to talk to you people here about the struggles that we have within schools around the kinds of human that are permitted to flourish within schools, and the kinds of those others who are not allowed to often even be there. The third reason to ask a question about the human is, I believe, prompted and encouraged through the work of Frantz Fanon. And I think in particular his book, Black Skin, White Masks. At the start of Fanon's book, he kicks off with quite a shocking sentence. And it reads, "The black man does not exist." When I first read it, I thought, well, what's going on here then? Clearly, alienation. But what Fanon is developing there is the idea that within the dominant cultural imaginary that has been constituted by the white man, the black man does not exist. And indeed, I think this is a very helpful and scary premise for thinking about the ways in which, for example, the disabled child does not exist within the schooling setting. By that, I mean that there's schools that are increasingly born upon this neoliberal and individualized idea of marketization and performance. One could argue, thank you, Mr. Gove, again, that the disabled child has never been more alienated or erased than right now. And to what extent can we, as educators and as psychologists, include disabled young people in schooling settings which are increasingly written for a very narrow sense of achievement, attainment, and success? In this sense, then, I think it's helpful to use Fanon's work to start with the assumption that the disabled child does not exist within schooling settings. And this, of course, is a deeply unsettling idea. The fourth reason of thinking of the human, and I've started to refer to anyway, is disability. Disability and the emergence of disability studies across many disciplines, including psychology and educational psychology, has consistently evidenced the ways in which disabled people are routinely dehumanized in educational, social, and community settings. The government is being investigated through the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People around the suggestion that the human rights of disabled people are being worked against through these austerity measures. We know that in austerity, disabled people are amongst the first often to suffer. And we also know, thinking about disability, that disability provokes a consideration yet again of the kinds of citizen we value and the kinds of citizen we don't. But what I want to do in my talk in a short while is to suggest that I don't want to depress everyone here, to actually come away with the idea that disability is a possibility. And increasingly within disability studies writing is the argument that disability is to be desired. And by that, the idea that disability is a starting point to think through how we might rethink our relationships with one another. And in this way, disability studies shares much with post-colonial ideas and so on. A fifth reason to think about the human is apparently we now live in post-human times. So this is, if there's one thing you could take away for cocktail parties over the coming months from this presentation, is the idea of the post-human, developed by people like Rosie Braidotti and, of course, by Donna Haraway. Now, what is very interesting about this is the blurring of the human and technological and cultural worlds that we are seeing. And the ways in which, according to post-human scholars, the human being is actually not a category that anybody desires anymore. We just want to be more than human. And that might be through human enhancement, and it might be through, of course, the blending of the wetware of bodies with the hardware of technology. But I think the post-human also permits us to think of the human category not simply as an isolated, fleshy thing, but actually something that is more extended and more connected with other fleshy bodies, but also non-fleshy things like technology and so on. And I want to return to the idea of the post-human as perhaps a way of thinking about the politics that we might want to enact when we think about things like inclusive education. And the final, if you like, intellectual or area that I want to kind of flag up, or as a reason why we want to consider the question of the human, relates to an intellectual and political project that I've been working on with Rebecca Lawtham and Catherine Runswick-Cole from Manchester Metropolitan University and Kirsty from Sheffield and myself, called The Dishuman. In embracing the ambivalence that people like Braidotti, Sylvia Winter, Frantz Fanon and Donna Haraway and so on have towards the human, our Dishuman project seeks to disavow the human. By this we mean we're interested in the ways in which the human category is something that people or groups of people continue to desire because they've been cast outside of that category. The very existence of human rights legislation for disabled people, this is, let's be honest, it's only 20 years old, which is in itself a shocking realization, is still clearly evidence of the ways in which many disabled people are not considered to be fully human. And just to go back to an image that I wanted to, like, there's a flag there that is which reads Justice for LB. And Justice for LB is a campaign that came about through a friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Ryan, whose son, Connor, died in an assessment and treatment unit after being left to bathe in a bath for 3 hours with the full knowledge that he actually had epilepsy, and he had a fit in the bath and he drowned. And what that campaign has done is to shine light on the ways in which people, young people with learning disabilities, still are treated as less than human. And rather than blame individual members of staff within that assessment and treatment unit, what the campaign has done is to draw our attention to the way in which we as a society, as a collective, continue to treat people with intellectual disabilities as anything other than human. So the first part of the Dishuman project is to make a simple but not simplistic point. People with intellectual disabilities are also human beings. But how often do we, as practitioners or as researchers, spend our daily lives having to remind people of this very basic point? And indeed, how often do we work in educational settings where the very systems are set up to dehumanize whole groups of young people? This seems to be about human politics and something that we as a collective are engaged in. The trouble is, of course, is that the human category, if we listen to Sylvia Winter, is very much a white man invention. And indeed, the human category is something that certain people are allowed to occupy while others aren't. In this sense, then, the second part of the Dishuman project seeks to be more post-human. By that we mean, whilst we want to desire the human category, we also want to enlarge it, to expand it, and to rethink what being human means. Again, a disavowal of the human. We desire the human, but at the same time we want to push against some of the kind of narrow ideas around it. So an undergirding argument of this paper is that people with intellectual disabilities are already engaged in what we might term a dishuman politics. And young people with learning disabilities are engaged, if we listen carefully enough, often in some pretty radical work in their own communities. And this is what we mean by disability as being something that we desire. That disability becomes not a problem to correct, but a starting point for thinking through our politics. So, for the remaining parts of this paper, I will expand upon this politics, referring to work with young people with intellectual disabilities. And I will illuminate the ways in which their activism might be understood in terms of what we call dishuman activism. And in this sense, I want to kind of say more about what we call a dishuman positionality. Okay, so the past 20 years I've been lucky enough to work with many people with learning disabilities. When I started, there was still a debate around whether it was called mental retardation or learning disabilities, and I'll now use the term intellectual disabilities, people first, interchangeably, to reflect the complex ways in which people with that label have challenged some of the labelling that goes on. And my research has involved research with people as co-researchers, and I've also been lucky enough to be a voluntary supporter and an advisor to a self-advocacy group in Huddersfield in West Yorkshire. To those who don't know, self-advocacy groups are 40 years in the making. They were set up by people, young people and older people with intellectual disabilities. And the focus of those groups is they were run by and for people with learning disabilities themselves. They would run in schools, in colleges, in residential units, in the community, in local pubs, in local day centres. And we have over 40 years now of a history of the politics of self-advocacy. In 2000, I published a book, which is my PhD thesis, which reflected upon working with a number of self-advocacy groups to try and make sense of the ways in which their community living, their employment experiences, their education, and their leisure were enabled or disabled by the people around them. And over the last 17 years since my book was published, what we've seen is a huge growth of what we might call activist literature, written by people with the label of learning disabilities. People with learning disabilities have fought alongside their physically impaired peers for their human rights. I'm thinking of key names like Gary Borley, Simone Aspis, people who would, in their early childhood, were placed in special schools and considered to be ineducable, are now the very people that are talking to policy makers and training professionals about how to support young people with intellectual disabilities. And they have fought alongside their physically impaired peers for their human rights. Alongside this growing representation, there have been major developments in terms of how disability has been theorised. While disability remains broadly conceptualised in terms of theories of social oppression, disability is increasingly being reframed in terms of possibility and disruption. This is something called crip theory, where the word crip is being reappropriated as a positivity. In short, people and young people with intellectual disabilities can't help but disrupt and crip the spaces that they occupy. There ain't no more disruptive thing than getting disability in a school. And let's be honest, there are those times where you can see people are getting really upset by disability, and it's really messing with, the school profile and their achievements and what have you. And you just laugh in the car afterwards. But at the same time, we recognise that disability is an opportunity to rethink what we do in our educational settings. So crip desires have produced new forms of agitation, organisation and relationships to the study and politics of disability. Many of us can now state with confidence that disability is not just something that signifies discrimination or social inequality. Disability denotes affirmation. Disability is something to be desired because it broadens what we understand as being human. So what I want to do is to spend the rest of the paper now just to unpack some key elements of how disability works with the human condition. I want to unpack some very human elements and disability's place in desiring, but also redefining these elements, a position that, as I said earlier, we might call the dishuman. So the first element is that of support. Rather than viewing support as something that a human needs when they are found lacking, we might instead recast support as a marker of humanity. Specifically, an invitation to be supported is an indicator of human vulnerability. And to require support is to be human. To be human is to need others, and without others, we would not be human. Now, increasingly, I would suggest, I don't think controversially, that our schooling system is set up around individual notions of competence, autonomy, and self-sufficiency. Perhaps education or mass education has been ever thus, about individual achievement. But I think various iterations of what we might call neoliberal education over the past 20 years have left us in I would suggest, a rather dangerous space. A space where the idea of vulnerability as a human quality is something that we dare not speak of, that schools dare not mention, that young people dare not display. This is where disability is helpful. Disability acts as a mirror to humanness, to reflect back interdependence and mutuality as necessary human characteristics that sadly often get lost in a contemporary society that attaches far too much significance to individual achievement, isolated self-sufficiency, and economic gain. Disability affirms human vulnerability, and in so doing, reaffirms what it means to be human. But disability does not just do that. Disability does not do away with the desire for example, economic self-sufficiency, or for that matter, individual achievement. And one only has to look at 50 years of disability studies literature to reveal that disabled people and their allies have always lived a very frictional, contradictory life. This is what Rod McAlco, a blind scholar, calls the difference that disability makes. Disabled people and their organisations, of course, call to be known as human. If we take the most popular term for self-advocacy groups in this country, it's people first. The very fact that people with intellectual disabilities are calling their groups people first is a deeply political, ontological, we could use all the psychology words here, couldn't we, moment of recognition. But if we spend a little time with those very same self-advocacy groups, we'll notice that, and we're drawn to some of the innovative ways in which they work. So, for example, one of the slogans of the self-advocacy movement is label jars, not people. Though, of course, the idea of a people, the idea of a person is itself a label. At the same time, when one interrogates the ways in which self-advocacy groups are desiring recognition as human beings, they also reveal the interdependent workings of self-advocacy groups. So, most groups are supported by people without the label of intellectual disabilities. They're called advisors. And these working relationships are deeply sophisticated, as all human relationships usually are. Advisors work hard to make sure that their views, ambitions, and perspectives do not direct members with intellectual disabilities. And self-advocates, this is the term used by people with intellectual disabilities, are moved and shaped by the support networks around them. And they, of course, themselves shape their own networks. Hence, in order to be recognised by the normative register of humanness, a person first, self-advocacy groups construct very nuanced forms of collective work and action. And these toned forms are made available through the presence of this phenomenon termed intellectual disability. So this disability category brings together people in the first place and provides a platform from which to collectively claim through support, a seat at the humanist table. We are people first. We are humans too. Disability then affirms interdependencies that define us as human beings. And the presence of intellectual disability also brings with it a number of innovative demands of and invitations to support. One of the kind of well-worn tropes used by inclusive educators is that disabled children, when they enter a school, non-disabled children will learn a lot from having disabled children around them. We'd like to push that further. Disability enters a school and reaffirms our interdependencies. Interdependencies that we worry are being eroded by the narrowing of curriculum and the increased marketisation of schooling. So that's the first idea that we want to kind of reclaim, if you like, the idea of support. The second is frailty. Now, many disabled activists would have real problems with this choice of word here. Disability activism has spent many years rightly pointing out that disabled people are not frail, dependent, tragic burdens on society. Disabled people are people. But at the same time, we think that disability allows us to reclaim such a word. Frailty is a term that seems miles away from the uber-competent and self-aggrandizing individual of our contemporary times. Frailty is not a word that Farage nor Trump will use or to celebrate. And indeed, the language of Brexit, for example, was very much away from frailty. It was very much about self-containment, autonomy, self-sufficiency, isolationism, and so on. We want to reinsert frailty as a trope that can be useful, a way of thinking about the ways in which we work together. Recently, we've argued that we live in a time of what we call neoliberal ableism. And this is what we're talking about there, is the idea that we live in a time of the privatization of the self, the marketization of everyday life, and the justification of austerity politics, because at the end of the day, when the welfare system rolls back, competent, self-sufficient, working and shopping citizens can step up. Notice the ableist language there. You rarely wheel up. You step up. It's the argument that we now live in, and it seems that it's been won, is that global citizens will work and shop themselves into positions of self-sufficiency that no longer require the support of government nor the services of the welfare system. And in these competitive and individualistic times, why would anyone want to claim frailty as something that stigmatizes them? You don't want to be calling yourself frail now. That would just reveal you as a burden on the ever-decreasing welfare state. Our sense, though, is that disability politics does some interesting things with the idea of frailty. For a number of years, I had the pleasure to work with a woman called Joyce Kershaw. Joyce was a woman identified with the label of learning disabilities that had been in and out of institutions, and for the latter kind of 5 to 10 years of her life, when I knew her, was involved, it seemed, daily having massive arguments with managers of group homes, local MPs, and anyone in a shop that would say anything disabling remotely about herself or her friends. It was great. Whenever you went out for a coffee with Joyce, you were out for about 3 hours, and she nearly punched about 7 people. Challenging behaviour, folks. That's what she used to be known as. She was then, when I met her, she was known as an activist. Interesting how things can change. Now, one of the things Joyce would often say to me is that we all have learning difficulties. Now, by this, she was not simply placing us all on some new spectrum of human variegation, like we do with autism at the moment. Everyone's on the autism spectrum. In fact, I went to a conference a couple of months ago where a paediatrician was telling us that we need to plot everybody on the autism spectrum, everybody. And I asked him about that. The spectrum I was aware of, the rainbow and humanity. And he was introduced, anyway, that's one for another time. What Joyce is talking about there, in the idea of us all having learning disabilities, is that she's alerting us to the ways in which everybody fails to match up to the high standards and augmented ideals associated with human health and well-being. We are all fail in ableism. Here's the good news. We're all frail. This is not just something that disabled people and their or disabled young people and their parents have to fight. We're all in this together. We all have difficulties. Indeed, being frail, being precarious is precisely what makes us human beings. And Joyce was clear about the power of people with learning disabilities and their collective durability to work against a disabling society. She spoke to me about Huddersfield People First's success in getting the local council to stop using the term mental retardation in their policies. I witnessed her take apart numerous professionals in day centres and group homes when she felt they were preventing service users and residents from becoming involved in self-advocacy. This was a show of strength by Joyce and her comrades against the pathologising gaze of professionals and services. It was also a mark of the muscle and vigour of her activism. But the point, so often for Joyce in her work, was the simple notion that she and her comrades could not do their work alone. Individually, they would struggle, but together they were powerful. Acknowledging our frailty demands a collective response. And this sense of a shared frailty as a meeting point for activism harks back, of course, to long-held debates within feminism around human vulnerability, Martha Nussbaum, and so on. So in recognising frailty as part of the human condition, we would argue that this reaffirms a politics of interdependency. And in the, again, increasing marketisation and segregation of particular kinds of professionals, we need to remind ourselves of the collective links we have with one another, but also within our communities. Perhaps there's something good that can come from Brexit and Trump, in the sense that we actually refined our communities. And this point leads to the third area I want to suggest that we need to kind of rethink and reclaim, and that is capacity. Now, this might seem odd because capacity and frailty seem to be totally different entities. On one hand, we kind of want to embrace the idea of frailty, but also capacity. Well, what marks both frailty and capacity, we would argue, is interdependence and a distributed understanding of these entities. An overused word within social policy and educational policy is resilience. And resilience is often understood as an individualised psychological trait that some people seem to have and some don't. Some people are resilient, other people are not. So when you have a shit day and you feel depressed, you're not being very resilient, so there's clearly something wrong with you. That it is January, so don't worry, right? And it seems to us that these very individualised ideas of resilience are missing the reliance that we all have upon one another. And indeed, disability enters this debate and says that capacity is not an individual trait. So our call for frailty as a trope around which to organise politically and theoretically, one wonders what might be left of the notion of capacity. When this term is evoked, it recalls synonyms such as aptitude, faculty, and competence. And these synonyms quickly become wrapped up in the language of neoliberal ableism, and we would suggest humanism, as abilities owned by some and not by others. For people with intellectual disability, it's been paramount to keep hold of these concepts in order to demonstrate their capacities as human beings. If you are a young person or a person with intellectual disabilities and you have a child, you have to reach gold standards of parenting that no parent without intellectual disabilities ever has to achieve. You will be assessed. If you are a young person with disabilities, you will have to demonstrate forms of competence and capacity that keep you in those schools in ways that do not disrupt, quote, the learning of other non-disabled children, end quote. Indeed, to be a successful disabled young person in schools, one often needs to almost pass as non-disabled, or at least keep the noise down. Indeed, if you're a disabled person in class, you can't even piss around in the classroom because you've got a learning supporter sat next to you. We'll have true inclusion when we find that disabled young people are excluded for taking drugs rather than being excluded for disrupting other people's learning. So what disability is doing here, we would suggest, is it's reminding us that no one is trying to push away totally against an individually owned idea of capacity. One might argue that disabled young people already have an uber form of capacity to actually still be alive, to still be in the context, in many contexts where they are not wanted or pushed away. But we also want to recognise that in order to demonstrate capacity, like support, requires imagination and it requires other people. In this sense, then, disability has always been post-human. If post-human means that we are expansive as humans, that we require connections with other humans and non-human others, including technology, animals, and so on. Disability deconstructs capacity as an individual psychological trait or an individual asset, and instead opens up capacity as a relational and materially realised through our host of networks, assemblages, and connections. Capacity is not simply something we own, but an entity enacted with other humans and non-humans. Capacity is something that emerges through the presence of a person in the world. And this phenomenological complexity, as we all know and feel, makes us human. So to the final elements that we would want to reclaim, and that is of desire. It would seem strange to start with a psychoanalytic concept like disavowal and not actually have another psychoanalytic idea like desire in there. But it leads us to a very simple question. What do we desire in these neoliberal able times? And what do we as practitioners, researchers, people living in the world discuss, talk about, and prompt in relation to desire? Clearly, in educational settings, the main desire is for individual achievement and progression. That is the desire expected of schools, and increasingly it's expected and pushed through a desire to do well in exams. I can't be the only parent of teenage kids who is finding it increasingly difficult in remaining positive about the educational climate in which those young people are based. When my 50-year-old came back and said, so let's just get this right, school now is just about learning lots of shit that you'll never use. Obviously, I didn't let her get away with that. But, you know, the idea that, you know, she said, so it's now just become about a memory test, does it? You know, these are the kind of things we've always heard about education, but it seems to be a strange state of affairs that we now are in, where the main desire of the educational setting is for young people to remember stuff and then regurgitate it. You know, because of course when people ask me a question, a difficult question, I never Google it. I just go to the local library, sit for a number of hours and get back to them with a 1,500-word essay. Strange times we live in. So what can we desire in these neoliberal able times? The post-human literature has asked some searching questions about what we're going to do to the human in a time of technology, globalization, and militarization. What kinds of human enhancement are we wanting to produce and endure? What is it about the human we want to keep or to enhance? Disability, I feel, asks us to think again about the objects of our desires. Let's take two. Having enough money or credit cards to spend and working hard to demonstrate one's worth. Two practices valorized by society. But two practices, interestingly, immediately contested by disability, but equally desired by disability. People, young people with intellectual disabilities, have the desire to work, to find positions of employment, to do well, to be valorized. This is not that disability comes in and we get rid of those kind of desires, but at the same time, disability asks some quite searching questions around our desires. In rich income nations such as ours, the benefits trap is one that has been bastardized by right-wing debates. The benefits trap might be reframed as the inflexibility of welfare to permit people to work sometimes and keep hold of welfare entitlements that support people to live within their homes with support, often with families. Daniel Blake, is, you know, forget writing academic papers, captures quite simply and beautifully and in a horrific way the complexity of the welfare system that does not flex around people. Many disabled people have reminded us of the inflexible ways in which work is supported by governments and desired as the only meaningful contribution to society. Disability can also go further in flattening a desire for work or consumption as the only ways of exhibiting one's human competence. How might we understand a young person with complex needs who may not achieve well in education and might never work? How might we include a person like that in our practice? And at the same time, how might we think of, for example, a person with profound impairments who produces labour for a number of people? All of us in this room exist in our professional practice or our jobs because disability exists. Without disability, we wouldn't even be in Harrogate today. There's a thought. So, ironically, disability permits thousands, millions of jobs to exist. But at the same time, people with complex needs demand us to ponder the rigidity of value in paid work. Those that cannot work do not have this activity as an individual skill to highlight to others. And yet again, disability pushes us to think about the direct links between the current educational system and employment. Employability, I mean, it's a word, it's bandied around all the time. When did education just become all about remembering stuff and employability? One could argue historically, well, it always was ever thus. But what kind of new configurations are happening here, which is narrowing the meaning of education, which will lead inevitably to the exclusion of many young people. One of the few positives of living in austerity Britain, are there any? So it seems, is a replenishing of activism and a collegiality amongst many people. Whatever you think about the whether or not whatever you think about Jeremy Corbyn, what is very interesting is there has been a rebirth of particular kinds of left thinking. It seems very kind of fragmented in many ways, but we would argue that disability might allow us a particular space to think again about what we desire. We need to have rethink desires and rethink about desires that are pushed away from a narrow obsession with labour and shopping and a more generalist interest in collective belongings and becomings. Okay, so to conclude, the disability studies scholar Rod McCalco expressed his worries about the impact of disability studies and educational psychology on the rest of the normative world. He argues that disability studies has done nothing to change the world because we see day to day the exclusion of disabled young people from our everyday lives. Could we say the same thing about ourselves? Research and practice has done nothing. We are caught up in wider structural politics and wider changes within the education system that are undermining the radical potential of both educational psychology and research. Have we, any of us in this room, really disrupted anything? And I think that Rod's question is a really powerful one. He reminds us that, and to use his words, that the cultural ideology of normalcy is very good at recuperating itself. Schools are very good at doing this, and educational systems are very good at keeping their status quo. And Rod's work reminds us of the inbuilt durability of normalcy within education systems. And to this we would add the ubiquitous nature of neoliberal ableism, which is narrowing what it means to be a citizen. So has disability really disrupted or usurped normalcy? And has educational psychology really the potential to contest some of these normative workings? And I'm going to end positively. And people might suggest that this is idealistic, utopian bullshit. I'm happy with that idea. And I can see the t-shirt already. This is what a utopian bullshit artist looks like on here. The reason that we have to is because when we go back to some of the starting writers, the inspiring writers, when we think of people like Frantz Fanon, and we think of people like Sylvia Wynter, these are not obscure, left field desires to change the world. They come from post-colonial settings. They come from critical race theory. They come from disability theory. We're not talking about a few people here, we're talking about all of us. We're talking about the very nature of humanity. Or as Winter would put it, those people engaged in the empirical struggle. And I would like to suggest that that's what we're doing. My sense is that disability, as one example, has at the very least started to unsettle normative ideas of the human. The human being, at least as it's held up in Western Europe and North America, continues to display its colonial, racist and capitalist origins. Think of the rhetoric of Trump and of Farage. How that language was used, and Trump's language in particular was used in such a way that it could play upon colonialist, racist ideas. The human being is evoked as something to desire, commensurate with societal development and economic progress. But we should not forget that the human is tied to civil and social rights, and so is disability. Disability messes with, subverts, revises, reassesses, and troubles what it means to be a human being. And most importantly, disability has worked hard at the normative centre, evidenced by the activism of people with intellectual disabilities described in this paper. Indeed, as we speak now, there are young people with intellectual disabilities, whether they know it or not, are doing some incredible work disrupting the normative centre of schools. Now, whether or not this is radical enough is open to question. And of course, it's a question we should always keep open. But in these times of globalised ableism, one wonders what is really to be done. Perhaps, at least by creating some friction and tension, disability shaken, if not stirred, one element of the normative centre. And in thinking of the human, disability always has a chance of being a little bit unsettling. And maybe educational psychology has a little bit of unsettling quality to it. And this little bit of unsettling, of course, is a very human quality. And my hope is in this paper that I've been able to document some of the ways in which we can work with disability as a potential to disavow and unsettle the human category. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I'm fascinated and troubled by the power and limitations of language. I'm also troubled by the use of categories and labels. And I just wonder, my question is, are we at risk of playing the devil's game by talking about categories and kinds of people?
Yes. I really like the idea of disavowal, because I think disavowal it kind of, in some ways, kind of lets you out of it a bit, but also draws you back in. I don't think we can avoid it, and I think you know that in the language games I was playing then with the idea of the human, that is itself, another form of labelling and language. And I recognise that the danger of a disability studies perspective is that it reaffirms disability potentially as a naturalised concept. But I think that those categories exist. I think they're there. I think without them we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have jobs, and we wouldn't be talking of ideas associated with practice or with research. And I think there's
to what extent are they in danger of becoming essentialised?
Always. And I think particularly, and this is why I think that the idea of ableism is helpful, because what it does is it draws attention to this wider backdrop, this wider dominant culture that inevitably produces those kind of essentialized languages, you know, associated with race or with disability. And I think one of the things I'm interested about with Trump is that I don't buy the post-truth argument. I think what's happened with Trump is there's been a reassertion, almost like a kind of, you know, 100-year-old reassertion of a narrow concept of the human. And one of the ways we want to look at it is to think about the kind of ableism that's actually at play in the discourse of both Trump and of Brexit. That, you know, I'm not quite sure what happens to somebody who doesn't fit that kind of narrow way of being, if you're, you know, a refugee, other, a person of colour or disabled person. It seems to me that you are automatically erased. So in that sense, I think I want to signify more. I want to use more labels in the sense of trying to capture the kind of, I think, culturally violent work that's going on.
I just wonder whether it would be even more disruptive to abandon the use of labels.
So the question there was, would it be more disruptive to abandon labels? I mean, that's kind of what self-advocacy has done, you know, tried to do. And of course, the potential for deconstructing labels is huge, and I'm sure everyone here would share that. I suppose my anxiety is that in doing it, we end up speaking a language that's not actually played out in the rest of the world, you know. People are using language, these kind of labels all the time. Think about the ways in which autism is now, oh, you know, my uncle, clearly he was autistic, he was in the shed most of his time. You know, this kind of, you know, going back and using it. So I've total sympathy with the idea of getting rid of labels, but it seems to me that the rest of the world is not doing that. So we need to kind of, it seems, intervene there.
It just made me think of the current situation about gender and transgender. There's a huge movement now, particularly amongst young people, that are rejecting the idea of being male or female and are taking it forward that there's many different ways of presenting as a person, as a human, which is not related to a particular description. And is that something that's worth kind of allying with a challenge to a view of you are able-bodied or you're disabled and you're not? Yeah. I mean, it seems to me there's a bit of an opportunity there to take that on board. So it's just a comment, really. Well,
and absolutely. So the crip theory is you know, reflects kind of activism and political work, which has come out of the kind of intersections of lesbian, gay, trans politics and disability politics. What's interesting is that there's kind of, whilst contesting some of the binary labels, we're now having different kinds of specific labels and identity labels that people are occupying. So I, for example, wouldn't want to say to someone who claims autism, well, that doesn't exist, it's a psychopathology created by Baron Cohen and his mates. Well, it might be fun at a cocktail party, but, you know, because there's some very interesting stuff around autism self-advocacy going on. So, yeah, I think there's definitely kind of links between the kind of trans politics and disability politics.
I was just thinking about Simon's question. I'm sorry to go back to that, but just thinking about language, it's obviously very historically contextual, what language you use. And it seems to me that it's like it's a nudge operation. You see what the dominant discourse is, the language that's being used, and you try and nudge it to the next stage. You can't sort of just get rid of that discourse entirely. You can't ignore it. You try and nudge it forward in the right direction. But you keep interrogating it. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Do you believe it's possible for human beings to live in a non-exclusionary way?
Yeah, I'm a Marxist, so yeah. Well, I don't. What would we get up in the morning for? You?
What do I get up in the morning?
No, I mean, why would we get up in the morning if we didn't think people would work in kind of ways. I mean, are you less naive, or what's your thoughts?
Well, I think that labelling and identification and otherness and identifying otherness is a kind of a vulnerability at the heart of the human condition. And I think, for example, Jung and Freud were very good at sort of kind of identifying in that and talking about things like the shadow and these kind of concepts. And I think that the problem is that when we move to a different set of thoughts, we enter anew around what is a particular group or what isn't a particular group. We fall into traps of exclusion and inclusion because it's a kind of a vulnerability at the core of the human condition. But,
yeah, and then I think this is where I get about reclaiming psychology and psychological theory in the kind of discussions that we have around the nature of the human condition. It seems that psychology, obviously in popular representations of it, or if I'm thinking about some of my sociology colleagues, to them psychology is merely some kind of naive science of the individual. Whereas I think what you're hinting at there is something around considering emotion and other take psychoanalytic representations of the self are particularly helpful. One way we try to use it, for example, is to throw back onto normative, able-bodied culture a kind of psychoanalytic reading. And it seems that, what happens with disabled young people when they enter schools is they become the object of some quite psychologically messed up thinking on the part of the institution, the culture. And so I think that, again, psychology is really helpful for thinking through the systemic ways in which society is set up to not be inclusive. So I do also wake up in the morning thinking that the world is systemically unfair and there are barriers to disabled people's lives. That's the kind of starting point. But I try to be, I think this is a psychologist in me, I try to be optimistic about the human condition, that there's possibilities for connection. And just to finish that point, I think that disability has the potential in increasingly narrow cultural settings of schools to remind us of what the hell's education is for. Because I think disability can enter there and talk of things like interdependence. I can talk of inclusion it seems to me, is becoming increasingly a political response to the neoliberal project within schooling globally. Disability can help there. I would obviously say that, but I think disability has that potential.
Final question, I think it's always talking to.
Hi, I was just wondering what you felt the narratives around the Paralympics have done over the last, particularly the last 6 years, and what impact that's had on the concept of ableism. Yeah,
I'm going to leave it to the words of Liz Carr, who's a disability activist, a wheelchair user, who you might have seen on Silent Witness, who says that the trouble about Paralympics is when it's on and she goes out in a wheelchair, she has non-disabled people saying to her, "What are you going to do then?" I'm going to leave that one. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Just before we break